All right, let's do this. The Sleeping Prophet's Nuclear Warning. In January of 1939, a semi-literate farmer's son from Kentucky lay down on a couch, closed his eyes, and began to speak. His name was Edgar Cayce, and what he described in that session, recorded and archived as Reading 3976-15, was a coming weapon capable of splitting matter itself and devastating entire cities. The Manhattan Project did not yet exist as a classified program. The atomic bomb was a theoretical concept known only to a handful of physicists. Cayce had a sixth-grade education. Before 1939, prophecy was considered the domain of scripture and superstition. Cayce operated differently. Over his lifetime, he produced more than 14,000 documented readings, all preserved at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach. He had already predicted the 1929 stock market crash in a reading delivered in 1925. He had warned a sitting president about the dangers of a second term. His track record, measured against dated and archived records, was not a matter of faith. It was a matter of filing. The specifics are what make dismissal difficult. Cayce predicted the discovery of a submerged ancient site near the island of Bimini by 1968 or 69. Divers found the Bimini Road in 1968. He described a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx, containing records of a lost civilization. In 1996, the Shore Foundation conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Giza Plateau and detected subsurface anomalies beneath the Sphinx, consistent with underground chambers. The Egyptian government has restricted further excavation since. Cayce's predictions were not vague spiritual warnings, dressed in comfortable metaphor. The nuclear reading described, with clinical detachment, a force that would be unleashed from the structure of matter itself, used against populated areas, and would reshape global power. He said it was coming, and that humanity would have a choice about what followed. 2 years later, the most classified scientific program in American history began assembling that exact weapon in the desert. Cayce was not read into the program. He simply described it first. The hardest question isn't whether Cayce was right. The dated archive makes that uncomfortable enough. The hardest question is what system of perception he was accessing when his educated contemporaries had no knowledge of what he described. The readings don't read like guesses. They read like briefings from someone who had already seen the outcome. If the information came from somewhere, the more important question is where and whether whatever showed it to him is still transmitting. The Hopi Blue Star Prophecy. Centuries before European contact, before nuclear physics, before satellite imagery, before any of the technologies now reshaping the planet, the Hopi people of the American Southwest encoded a specific sequence of 9 signs into their oral tradition. These signs would appear in order, each one marking a stage in the unraveling of the current world. They were not presented as possibilities. They were presented as a sequence already known, a countdown already running, passed from elder to elder across generations that had no access to the future they were describing. The 9 signs were recorded in writing in 1958 when a journalist named David Young transcribed an account given by White Feather, a Hopi elder. The signs include iron snakes crossing the land, interpreted as railroads, spinning wheels filled with voices, interpreted as wagons and later automobiles, a cobweb spun across the sky, interpreted as power lines and aircraft contrails, land crossed by rivers of stone, interpreted as highways. And then the 5th sign, a gourd of ashes dropped from the sky that burns the earth and boils the oceans. Hopi elders in the 1940s named this the atomic bomb before most of the world understood what had been dropped on Hiroshima. The 6th sign describes the land turning reddish from cattle overgrazing. The 7th describes the sea turning black, interpreted as oil spills. The 8th describes young people wearing long hair and living outside the established social order, language that matched the 1960s counterculture with a precision that startled the scholars who documented it. The 9th sign describes a blue star becoming visible in the sky, a celestial event preceding the purification. In 2007, Comet Holmes brightened by a factor of 1 million in 24 hours, briefly becoming visible to the naked eye. Some interpreted it as the 9th sign. Others are still watching. The Hopi do not describe a purification day as punishment. They describe it as correction, a reset built into the structure of reality, not imposed from outside it. Their cosmology tracks 4 world ages, each one ending when humanity loses its way, and each one giving way to the next. The Oribe Prophecy Stone in Arizona depicts 2 life paths diverging at a critical junction. One path curves downward, the other continues. The stone was carved long before anyone knew what the junction would look like. When a people with no access to modern science describe an atomic bomb as a gourd of ashes and sequence it correctly among 8 other signs, the word coincidence starts to carry more weight than it can bear. They named what we built before we built it. The question that remains is what they named in signs 8 and 9 and whether the sky has already answered. The Cumean, Sibyl, and Rome's final hour. Around 500 BC, a woman known as the Cumean Sibyl walked into the court of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, carrying 9 books of prophecy. She offered to sell them. The king refused. She burned 3 of them and returned, offering the remaining 6 at the same price. He refused again. She burned 3 more. When she appeared a 3rd time with the final 3 books and the original price unchanged, the king's advisors urged him to buy. He did. The original 9 books, whatever they contained, no longer exist. The 3 surviving volumes were installed in the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus and became one of Rome's most closely guarded state secrets. The Roman Senate consulted them only during moments of existential crisis, never for personal guidance, never for politics, only when the Republic or Empire faced a threat that conventional counsel could not address. They were not treated as poetry. They were treated as intelligence. When the temple burned in 83 BC and the originals were destroyed, Rome dispatched envoys across Greece, Asia Minor, and Africa to collect fragments and reconstruct a replacement collection. A civilization that spanned the known world spent years trying to reassemble a book of prophecy. The replacement texts that survive, known as the Sibylline Oracles, describe a sequence of world ages ending in cosmic fire and flood. Book 3 describes a king from the sun rising in the east who will trigger global war. Book 5 contains verses describing a great city consumed from above, language that resonates differently after the 20th century. Lactantius, the 4th century Christian writer, quoted the Sibyl extensively, treating her as a pagan prophet who had described the fall of Rome with political and structural specificity. Virgil's 4th Eclogue, composed in 40 BC, is widely read as a Sibylline-derived prediction of a golden age to follow a period of war and dissolution. Virgil was a court poet. His Golden Age poem was drawn from the same archive Rome's generals consulted before campaigns. The detail that stops the analysis cold is the burning. Emperor Augustus, in 12 BC, ordered the collection and destruction of more than 2,000 texts, circulating as Sibylline prophecies. He kept the official collection under lock and had the rest burned. The official explanation was that the unofficial texts were fraudulent. But Augustus was a man of extraordinary political intelligence. You do not destroy 2,000 documents because they are wrong. You destroy them because they say something specific enough to be dangerous. The original 9 books have never been found. What was in the ones she burned before the king agreed to buy? Whatever Rome's most powerful emperor found threatening enough to commit to fire, it was not vague enough to dismiss. The Sibyl walked in with 9 and left with none. Rome got 3. The other 6 burned at her hands. We have never stopped wondering what was in them. The Colburn Bible's coming destroyer. Among the strangest ancient texts in private circulation, one describes a celestial object with specific physical characteristics. A reddish glow, a trailing tail of debris, a gravitational pull powerful enough to disturb the oceans and crack the surface of the land. The Colburn Bible, a compilation of claimed Celtic and Egyptian texts held by the Chaldean Trust in New Zealand, calls this object the Destroyer. It does not describe it as a god or a metaphor. It describes it as a physical body that approaches Earth on a long cycle, causes catastrophic damage, and has done so before. The Egyptian section of the Colburn describes the sky darkening before the destroyer's approach, followed by earthquakes, mass flooding, and fire falling from above. This language tracks closely with the Ipuwer papyrus, known formally as Leiden Papyrus 1344, an Egyptian text describing a catastrophic societal collapse consistent with Exodus-era events. Rivers running with something red, darkness covering the land, the death of livestock, total social inversion. The two texts, one British in claimed provenance, one Egyptian in confirmed origin, describe the same sequence from different distances. That alignment is either a remarkable coincidence or a shared memory of the same event. In 1982, Oxford astrophysicists Victor Klube and Bill Napier published a book called The Cosmic Serpent, proposing that a large comet fragmented over the past 10,000 years, and that its debris field remains a periodic threat to Earth. The Taurid meteor stream, which Earth crosses in early November, is that debris field. It is not a relic. It is an ongoing encounter with the remnants of something large enough to have reshaped the ancient world if its parent body passed close enough during a prior orbit. Klube and Napier arrived at this conclusion through orbital mechanics, not mythology. The Kolbrin explicitly instructs its reader to preserve the record of the destroyer's prior visit, so that future generations will be warned when the signs begin. That instruction, embedded in the text itself, reframes the entire document. It is not a religious text describing divine punishment. It is a survival manual written by people who watched something cross the sky and understood they were recording a recurring event, not a unique one. The physical copies reportedly housed at Glastonbury Abbey before the fire of 1184 AD are gone. What survived did so in fragments, in copies of copies, carried forward by people who believed the warning mattered enough to keep moving it through time. The Taurid meteor stream peaks in the exact seasonal window the Kolbrin identifies as dangerous. That correlation was not constructed retroactively. It was in the text before Klube and Napier opened their telescopes. The question their work raises is whether the destroyer's last recorded pass was the last one, or simply the most recent one we have documented so far. Merlin's prophecies and the collapse of the West. In 1136 AD, a Benedictine cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth completed Historia Regum Britannia, and included within it a section he presented as a direct translation from an ancient source, a text in the Old British tongue given to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. That text was the prophecies of Merlin. Geoffrey claimed it was not his invention, but a transmission, a body of knowledge passed down through channels he declined to name fully. The original source book has never been found. The Prophetiae Merlini circulated separately within years of publication and was treated by medieval rulers not as literature, but as a strategic document. 3 English kings, Henry II, Richard I, and Edward I, reportedly made political and military decisions with reference to Merlin's prophecies, as documented in medieval chronicles of their reigns. This was not private superstition. It was institutional consultation. John of Cornwall wrote a serious theological commentary attempting to decode the texts in the 12th century. Alain de Lille produced his own analysis around 1182. These were not credulous men. They were among the most sophisticated intellectual figures of their era, and they treated the prophecies as something worth decoding rather than dismissing. The prophecies themselves use animal symbolism: a lion, a dragon, a boar, mapped across centuries onto specific monarchs by successive interpreters. One prophecy describes the island being reclaimed by its original name, read as a prediction of British national identity formation long before Britain existed as a political concept. Another describes the mountains of a western region erupting and the sea-swallowing coastlines. Language that some modern researchers have noted is consistent with isostatic rebound, the geological process of coastal flooding that followed the end of the last ice age. The prophecies describe the planets becoming disordered in their courses, a celestial disruption event preceding a final dissolution of existing orders. Nostradamus, in his correspondence, cited Merlin as a direct predecessor and claimed access to source materials from the same tradition. The connection is not incidental. Both men worked from the premise that the future was structured enough to be read, and both attracted the attention of crowned heads who took that premise seriously enough to act on it. The chain of transmission from the original British book, if it existed, through Geoffrey, through the medieval commentators, through Nostradamus, points to a body of predictive knowledge that kept finding new hands to carry it forward. Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, gave Geoffrey a book. Geoffrey published what it contained. Three kings governed partly by what Geoffrey published. Nostradamus built on what those kings had validated. The original book is gone. But the question it raises is not whether Merlin was real. The question is what the book contained that made a medieval monk cautious enough to say he was merely translating it, rather than claiming it as his own. The Book of Revelation's modern checklist. Written approximately 95 AD on the Greek island of Patmos by a man identified only as John, the Book of Revelation has been interpreted, decoded, and applied to contemporary events by scholars across 2 millennia. What makes the current moment different is not the interpretation. It is the convergence. Multiple markers described in Revelation as sequential preconditions to a world-ending judgment are not merely present today. They are measurable, documented, and occurring simultaneously in a way that has no precedent in the 2,000 years since the text was written. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program reported in 2023 that 117 active armed conflicts were ongoing worldwide, the highest number recorded since 1945. Revelation describes war as the first rider, preceding famine and plague, which follow in sequence. The Euphrates River, explicitly named in Revelation 16 as a body of water that will dry up before the final judgments, has lost more than 80% of its flow in some regions due to Turkish dam construction and regional drought documented by the United Nations and the World Bank. The drying of the Euphrates was treated as obvious metaphor for 19 centuries. It is now a measurable hydrological event confirmed by satellite. Revelation 11 describes the entire world witnessing a single event simultaneously, a physical impossibility in any era before broadcast technology. It is now the baseline condition of every major global event. Revelation 13 describes a mark on the right hand or forehead required to engage in commercial transactions. Subcutaneous RFID payment chips are commercially available in Sweden, the United States, and elsewhere. In 2014 and 2015, 4 blood moons occurred on Jewish feast days in a pattern called a tetrad, an astronomical event not repeated for centuries, matching the celestial signs described in Revelation 6. The re-establishment of Israel in its historic territory in 1948 is cited in evangelical eschatology as a trigger event, the generation marker from which a final prophetic sequence is counted. NASA and GES temperature records confirmed global heat records in 2023 and 2024, matching the 4th bowl judgment of Revelation 16, which describes the sun scorching the earth with intense heat. Each of these facts is individually documentable. The convergence of all of them within a single generation is the detail that John of Patmos may have found least surprising. Revelation was not written as a threat. It was written as a report from a man who claimed to have been shown what was coming and instructed to record it. Whether or not that framing is accepted, the checklist he left behind is filling in. The Euphrates is drying. The conflicts are mounting. The whole world now watches the same screen. If even one of these is a literal description of a future event, the question worth sitting with is which one you want to be standing in the wrong place for. Nostradamus and the 3 Antichrists. In May of 1555, a French physician and astrologer named Michel de Nostradame published Les Prophéties, a collection of 942 quatrains written in deliberately obscured Old French, Middle French, Latin, and Greek. The obfuscation was intentional. Nostradamus was a trained physician who had already demonstrated an ability to identify patterns in data that contradicted the consensus of his era, including the correct identification that plague was transmitted through contaminated materials rather than miasma, a conclusion that placed him decades ahead of accepted medical science. The mystical language of the quatrains was protective camouflage. The content was systematic. The case that cannot be easily argued away is Henry II of France. Nostradamus delivered a specific warning to the king. Do not engage in single combat, particularly involving a golden cage, a lion, and a wound to the eye. In 1559, 3 years after the warning, Henry jousted in a tournament. His opponent's lance shattered on impact. A splinter pierced the king's golden visor and entered his eye. Henry II of France died from the wound. The warning had been specific enough that the king's court acknowledged it after the fact. The king had simply chosen not to heed it. The framework of 3 antichrists is the most consequential and unfinished of Nostradamus' contributions. Century 8, Quatrain 1 contains the phrase Napoleon Roy, read by scholars as Napoleon. Century 2, Quatrain 24 contains the word Hister, which was also the Latin name for the Danube, a genuine ambiguity, though the surrounding verse describes a man of German blood who rises to power through terror and drags the world into war. The third Antichrist is described in multiple quatrains as coming from the east, triggering a conflict Nostradamus says will last 27 years. That war, by his calculation, has not yet begun. Nostradamus was not operating from faith. He was operating from a methodology he described in letters as the observation of celestial patterns, combined with a form of meditative vision that he explicitly compared to the ancient practice of scrying. He framed himself as a physician of future events, identifying symptoms and projecting trajectories. The French police reportedly referenced his quatrains during the Revolution, attempting to extract predictive guidance from a man dead for 200 years. Whether that helped them is unclear. Whether they felt they had no better option is not. The third Antichrist has not arrived. Nostradamus placed him in the east and assigned his conflict a specific duration. What Nostradamus did not place in ambiguity was the sequence. Napoleon came first, then the second, then a period of relative pause, then the third. We are in that pause. The third Antichrist, by Nostradamus' accounting, is not a past event being reinterpreted. He is a present absence, which is the most unsettling kind, the Mayan long count and the unfinished cycle. On December 21st, 2012, the Mayan long count calendar completed a 5,120 5-year cycle called the 13th Baktun, and the world laughed when nothing visibly collapsed. The laughter was based on a misreading. The Maya did not predict that the world would end on that date. They predicted that the current age would transform. The symptoms of that transformation, as described in the Chilambalam texts and the Dresden Codex, are not the dramatic collapse of a single day. They are the structural destabilization of all existing systems across the era that follows. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books held today in Dresden, Germany, contains a flood table in its final pages describing the destruction of a world age by water and a serpent in the heavens. The Chilambalam texts, colonial-era documents drawing on pre-conquest oral tradition, describe the post-13th Baktun period as an age of movement and instability, not extinction. The Maya tracked 5 world ages, each ended by a different catastrophe. The current age ends in movement and earthquake. That description maps to structural disruption rather than singular apocalypse, which is a considerably harder thing to recognize in real time. The astronomical precision of the Maya system is the detail that makes their structural predictions harder to dismiss. The Venus table in the Dresden Codex calculates Venus's synodic period at 583.92 days. The modern calculated value is 583.92 days. The long count calendar's tracking of the solar year is accurate to within fractions of a day across centuries of projection. Archaeoastronomer John Major Jenkins documented in Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, published in 1998, that December 21st, 2012 coincided with a rare alignment of the solar system with the galactic equator, an event occurring once every 26,000 years. The Maya calculated this alignment approximately 2,300 years before it occurred. The minds that produced Venus table accuracy to 4 decimal places and calculated a galactic alignment across millennia did not build their historical framework carelessly. The Chilam Balam describes the post-Baktun period with specific social markers, rulers who serve only themselves, the breakdown of knowledge systems, mass migration, and climatic irregularity. Post-2012, political polarization has reached measurably historic levels in multiple democracies simultaneously. Institutional trust, tracked by organizations including Edelman and Pew Research, has declined across every major category globally. Climatic irregularity is now documented by every major meteorological agency on the planet. They did not predict the end. They predicted exactly what follows the end of an age, which is the harder and more precise thing to predict. The question worth carrying is not whether the Maya were right about 2012. It is whether we are living in the symptoms they described, and whether the transformation they predicted as coming after the collapse is still ahead of us or already underway. The Sumerian Anunnaki return texts. The oldest written records on Earth were pressed into clay tablets in ancient Sumer around 3400 BC, more than 1,000 years before the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible were composed. They do not open with mythology. They open with administration, lists of goods, records of transactions, the names of rulers, and the lengths of their reigns. The Weld-Blundell prism, housed today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is a four-sided clay column inscribed with the Sumerian king list, a document recording the names and reign lengths of kings before and after a great flood. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After it, they ruled for decades. The list treats both sequences as continuous historical record. Sumerian civilization appeared with a speed that conventional archaeology still struggles to account for. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, codified law, urban architecture, and hydraulic engineering appear in the archaeological record nearly simultaneously, with no clear developmental predecessor culture in the same region. The Atrahasis epic, written around 1700 BC but believed to preserve much older oral tradition, describes beings called the Anunnaki, a term meaning, in the original cuneiform, those who from heaven to earth came, not as a grammatical metaphor, but as a grammatically literal description of arrival from above. These beings are described as creating humans to perform labor through a process involving the mixing of divine and earthly materials, a narrative structure that reads less like theology and more like a record of an event described by people who lacked the vocabulary for what they had witnessed. Cylinder seal VA-243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, depicts a central star surrounded by 11 celestial bodies. Zechariah Sitchin, whose translations beginning with the 12th planet, in 1976 remain contested by mainstream Assyriology, but specific in their claims, identified this as a representation of a solar system including a 12th body on an elongated orbit. The Dogon people of Mali possessed detailed knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye, documented by Robert Temple in the Sirius Mystery in 1976, and attributed by the Dogon themselves to amphibious beings who arrived from the Sirius system. Walter Cruttenden, in Lost Star of Myth and Time, published in 2005, proposed independently that our solar system may orbit a binary companion on a long cycle consistent with Sumerian catastrophe timelines. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the gods departing and leaving behind instructions for what humanity should preserve. The Sumerian texts do not describe the Anunnaki as permanent residents. They describe a presence, a period of direct interaction, and then an absence, with the implication of return embedded in the cyclical framework of Sumerian cosmology. The Sumerian king list does not end. It stops mid-sequence, as if whoever was maintaining it expected a continuation. The oldest written record in human history is not a myth. It is an administrative document that begins with kings who lived for 36,000 years, and a flood that ended an age, and it is followed by records of beings who arrived, intervened, and left. Whatever the Sumerians were recording, they treated it as history rather than religion. They built their entire legal, mathematical, and astronomical system on its foundations. The question their tablets raise is not whether we believe them. It is whether whatever they were recording on behalf of has a return date written somewhere in the parts of the archive we have not yet translated. The Vedic Yuga cycle and where we are right now. 12,000 years before Nostradamus picked up a pen, a civilization in the Indian subcontinent had already described time as a cycle of 4 ages, each one shorter and darker than the last, each one ending in a different form of civilizational collapse, and each one giving way to a new world after a twilight period of maximum chaos. The astronomer Aryabhata, writing in 499 AD, calculated the start of the current age, the Kali Yuga, to February 17th, 3102 BC, based on a specific observable alignment of the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn near 0 degrees Aries. Modern astronomical software has confirmed that an extraordinary planetary conjunction occurred near that date. The clock was set by looking at the sky. It has been running since. The Vishnu Purana and the Bhagavata Purana describe the Kali Yuga with social precision that reads, in 2025, less like ancient scripture and more like a briefing. Rulers seize the property of their subjects. Priests sell spiritual knowledge for money. The environment is treated as a resource to be consumed rather than a system to be maintained. Children abandon parents. Mass migration becomes common. Seasons produce rain at the wrong time and drought at the right time. The wealthy are venerated not for wisdom, but for wealth alone. These are not vague warnings about moral decline. They are structural descriptions of a specific phase in a documented cycle. The Kali Yuga has a duration of 432,000 years in traditional Vedic reckoning, but Sri Yukteswar Giri, in the Holy Science published in 1894, proposed an alternative calculation based on a 24,000-year solar cycle tied to a binary stellar companion. Under Yukteswar's timeline, the darkest point of the descending cycle bottomed out around 500 AD, and the ascending cycle has been underway since approximately 1700 AD, correlating with the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the exponential acceleration of human knowledge. Both timelines agree on the structure. They differ on the scale. Either way, the Vedic framework places the current era in a transitional period called the Yuga Sandhi, a twilight phase of maximum structural instability immediately preceding transformation. The Kalki Purana describes 10 markers present at the moment of the age's culmination. Rulers who abandon all ethical constraint, teachers who monetize knowledge, environmental collapse, erratic seasons, mass displacement, and a sky that burns in unusual colors. The Kalki figure who arrives at the culmination is not described as a spiritual metaphor. He is described with physical specificity, a birthplace, a mount, a purpose. Whether that arrival is understood literally or symbolically, the Vedic framework contains something the other traditions on this list do not. It contains a return address. It describes not just what collapses, but what comes after. And it describes the collapse not as punishment, but as a mechanical feature of time, as predictable and as inevitable as the turning of a season. Every item on this list, Cayce's archive, the Hopi's countdown, the Sibyl's burned books, the Destroyer's return, Merlin's animal kings, Revelation's checklist, Nostradamus' third absence, the Maya's age of movement, and the Sumerian departure log, each one is a fragment of a larger pattern. They come from different continents, different languages, different millennia, and different methods. But they describe the same thing, a cycle of civilizational collapse followed by transformation, with specific observable symptoms preceding the turn. We are not being warned about something that might happen. We are being shown a diagnosis for something already underway. The pattern was mapped long before the symptoms appeared. That is what makes it harder to dismiss with every year that passes. What you do with that knowledge is the only part none of them predicted. The archive is open. The evidence is documented. The clock that was set by a planetary alignment in 3102 BC is still running. It doesn't ask for belief. It asks for attention. If this list changed how you read the news, go to the comments and tell us which item you think is the one that can no longer be explained away. Make the case. The most important conversations about what is coming are happening right now, and they belong in the hands of people who refuse to stop asking why. Subscribe and make this channel your headquarters for that conversation.